addressing our free and decent people. As a free revolutionary intellectuals group, and in response to your expectations and hope, we followed the activity of the Statute Committee, which is an essential factor in our struggle for freedom. So based on facts and reality, we announce to you, it is obvious that the Statute Committee was founded by Iran, Russia and Turkey. The founding of the committee took place in the context of Ankara meeting 2019 and in a meeting between Pedersen and the ex-Syrian Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim. Based on the Resolution 2254, Iran, Russia and Turkey established that committee. A resolution that demands the achievement of a statute for the country. The resolution did not specify how, but it says that the statute must be achieved in 6 months. The know-how is, however, subjected to the dominance of Iran, Russia and Turkey, the countries that manage the Syrian crisis in according to their own interests, away from the safar and interests of the Syrian people. It is a mistake to believe that mentioned states are credible and trustful. States that have never shared the effort to found a just international community. Mentioned states are known by their imperialism and authoritarianism. So the committee became a mere tool for mentioned authoritarian Astanian Troika, simply to delay and distort the process. So instead of implementing the resolution and removing the head of that crisis, they try to reproduce the regime and corrupt the opposition institutions whose members are controlled and selected to comply with the multilateral interest of mentioned states. 4 years have passed and the committees keep the dispute over the statute, fleeing their obligations. Exploring the points of dispute, we find Iranian and Russian considerations on the statute table. The picture became clear in the 8th round. Here we present a brief on its manipulated activity. Since its early foundation, the regime handicapped the committee and rejected some opposition members of the committee, and the members were replaced. In the first round, they tried to attract the UN attention, gain international sympathy to the committee through being unified on issues that are mentioned in the UN resolution. So both committees and the NGO committee were united on the sovereignty and unity of the state. So they announced the unity on basic issues and just have some dispute on the shapement of the future government and future parliament. The NGO's delegation was at split. Some of them wanted a new statute while some others wanted to reform the contemporary statute. In the year 2019, the second round had failed because the opposition delegation proposed a timetable for the negotiation. The regime rejected that request. A 1-year delay was the outcome of the opposition proposition to have a timetable. By the end of August, they met again to put off the meeting because of coronavirus. After exercising political pressure and international efforts, they met again to have a new dispute over the national name of the Syrian regime delegation, and the Syrian delegation rejected the meeting between Jeffrey and Rayburn with the opposition delegation before the round took place. So the meeting failed again. After a UN mediation, they met in January 2020 in a fourth round in which the regime represented new issues that don't relate to the statute. Issues like ending the siege and anti-terror strategy and reconstruction. The Russians also brought the refugees issue, and the regime represented some other 8 points that don't relate to the statute also. The regime demanded condemnation of the occupation and compensation and support for the national army to defend the country. He also demanded respect to the national fan and to the national song, etc. And so the fourth round failed again. In the fifth round, by the year 2021, the opposition proposed a working method which was rejected by the regime. The opposition proposed also 9 rules concerning freedom, independence and sovereignty and were rejected by the regime because the regime considered the Iranian and Russian presence as legitimate. Additional proposals were made by non-regime delegations and they were rejected by the regime. The goal was to find shared points. Al-Kizbari, the chief of the Syrian delegation, said that each issue must be discussed separately. So the meeting failed again. The sixth round was described by observers, including Peterson, as disappointing. The opposition delegation said that the regime wants them to capitulate. So the priority for the regime was sovereignty and anti-terror strategy based on his own understanding. The opposition represented a bill on the intelligence services and on the army, and the NGOs delegation brought a bill on the sovereignty of the law. So the round failed again. The seventh round took place in the year 2022. In that round, the regime represented a bill concerning the basis of the rule and the emblems of the state. And the opposition proposed a bill concerning the structure and functions of the general authorities. That round failed again. In the eighth round, 4 paragraphs were discussed. The opposition said that the regime represented a bill to defeat the revolution. The regime focused on the preservation of the state's institutions and on the stance of the opposition concerning the international treaties and agreements. It was clear that the goal is to protect the Iranian expansion and to ensure the Russian future control of Syrian national treasure and national resources. At the end of the meeting, they proposed a 9th round by the end of July 2022. The round didn't take place yet, and we are still waiting for that 9th theatrical piece. In each round, Iran and Russia were trying to legitimate their presence, jumping over the sovereignty of the state, trying to reduce their contemporary fake legitimacy to the future government, which is supposed not to be an expansion of the contemporary government. The feasible and helpful national proposals were frozen and removed from the table. That game of playing cat and mouse is unacceptable for the Syrian people. The opposition was asked to announce the failure of the negotiation and go back to the Security Council to find an alternate solution, but Al-Bahra, the chief of the opposition delegation, was insisting on the continuity of that game and that scene on the stage, and on the continuity of reserving political prostitution's hotels also. 4 years of a deliberate dispute. In that way, they help the continuity of the tragedy and the attempt to restore the legitimacy of the regime and give foreign occupation forces more power to establish control. For many reasons, the program of the Statute Committee doesn't comply with the UN resolution. The UN resolution 2254 that was issued 8 years ago says that the statute must be achieved in 6 months. It took the Statute Committee 4 years and not done yet. That is first. Second, the resolution says that the Syrian people determine their own future. The Statute Committee doesn't bear in mind that the Syrian people have the right to vote in a referendum about the disputed points. Third, the Statute Committee proposed some issues that don't relate to the statute, and it's clear that Russia and Iran are trying to influence the Statute Committees and the statute negotiations through imposing some issues that don't relate to the Syrian culture and Syrian people's demand. They do that despite the fact that the UN resolution doesn't consider the Russian and Iranian treaties and agreements with the regime. The goal of the resolution is to liberate the Syrian people from the contemporary regime. The goal of the regime proposed issues such as removing the sanctions, ending the siege, or protecting his contemporary institutions is to acquire immunity for his team and his personals through the statute. And this is not implied by the UN resolution, whose target was to replace this regime with a futurely elected government. The Regime Statute Committee is not independent, and it has always brought the Assad proposals to the table. Assad and his committee are, however, exposed to Russian and Iranian blackmail. Without Russian and Iranian protection, they can't survive. So the Regime Statute Committee doesn't represent the will of the Syrian people and act in according to the will of the regime, a regime that is depending on Russian and Iranian protection. So the Regime Statute Committee is singing a different melody and is controlled by the contemporary leadership who is the cause of the crisis. The Opposition Statute Committee is also influenced by Turkey. In the opposition area, elections have never taken place. It is suspicious to have a committee representing an area where parliaments don't exist and elections have never taken place. As a free revolutionary intellectuals group, we call on the Security Council to interfere and impose a timetable, letting the statute committees end their negotiation and achieve the statute within 6 months, complying with the UN Resolution 2254 and leaving the disputed points to the voters. So the disputed points can be decided through a held referendum under control of the United Nations. If the Statute Committee doesn't adhere to the UN resolution and achieve the statute in 6 months, the Security Council should end its activity because it violates the UN resolution. The alternate way to achieve or write a statute is to put the Syrian parliament under control and supervision of the United Nations. And let the opposition delegation meet there to write a statute concept, leaving the disputed points as an option for the voters in a held referendum under control of the United Nations. and that effort should not exceed the timetable of 6 months mentioned in the UN Resolution 2254. It lies in the interest of some parties on both sides to block that process. So the Statute Committee, and in response to some parties on both sides, is trying to bring the negotiation to a deadlock street. As mentioned in the UN Resolution 2254, the Statute Committee was supposed to have written the statute within 6 months. It took 4 years, and until now we have no statute yet. Simply because after writing the statute, Assad and some opposition leaders accused of war crimes, will be on the table, and possibly will have to leave Syria with their sponsoring occupation forces. That is why they are trying to influence the negotiation and negotiation members, and to manipulate the committees to block the process. So we call on the United Nations, on the Security Council, and on the Arab League to help end their blocking efforts. From now on, the Statute Committee must be a serious issue treated in the demonstration square, in media and social networks. Instead of writing the statute in 6 months, they continue blocking the negotiation and delaying the process. They act on order of their masters and blood merchants. Russia and Iran want to impose their rules on the statute and on the negotiation. Russia, Iran, and Turkey will continue trying to impose their rules on the negotiations in an attempt to make the statute recognize the legitimacy of their projects in Syria. We wouldn't have made a revolution if we will recognize the legitimacy given by this regime to Russia and Iran. The decisive paragraphs of the statute can be determined in a held referendum under control of the United Nations. They can't be determined by committee members selected or elected by occupation forces. The Free Syrian Revolutionary Intellectuals Group, 10th of October 2023.